How much does a teaspoon of coffee weigh? A teaspoon of coffee weighs around 2.5 grams. This is just an estimate, however, as the actual weight will vary depending on the type and grind of coffee used. A teaspoon of coffee weighs around 2.5 grams. This is just an estimate, however, as the actual weight will vary depending on the type and grind of coffee used. The weight of a teaspoon of coffee depends on the type of coffee, the grind, and the brewing method. For example, a teaspoon of finely ground coffee will weigh more than a teaspoon of coarsely ground coffee. And a teaspoon of coffee made with the drip method will weigh more than a teaspoon of coffee made with the French press method. So, how much does a teaspoon of coffee actually weigh? Unfortunately, there is no definitive answer. But we can give you a range to help you gauge how much your next cup of coffee will weigh. A teaspoon of coffee generally weighs between 2 and 5 grams. So, depending on your coffee type and brewing method, your cup of coffee could weigh anywhere from 10 grams to 50 grams. Keep in mind that the weight of your coffee will also depend on how much water you use. If you use more water, your coffee will be lighter in weight. Conversely, if you use less water, your coffee will be heavier in weight. So, now that you know how to measure a teaspoon of coffee beans. We all know how important it is to get our daily dose of caffeine, but sometimes we can forget just how much coffee we need to make that perfect cup. This is where measurements come in handy. But how do you measure a teaspoon of coffee? There are two ways to measure a teaspoon of coffee. The first way is by using a kitchen scale. Weigh out 2 to 3 grams of coffee beans and grind them up. Use this method if you want to be exact with your measurements. The second way to measure a teaspoon of coffee is by using a regular teaspoon. This is not as accurate as using a kitchen scale, but it will still give you a good idea of how much coffee you need. Scoop up some whole beans or ground coffee and put it in your cup. Start with 2 teaspoons and adjust according to your taste. So, now that you know how to measure a teaspoon of coffee, go ahead and make yourself that perfect cup. How many cups of coffee can you make with a teaspoon of coffee beans? A teaspoon of coffee beans can make around 2 to 3 cups. This will depend on the grind of the beans and how strong you like your coffee. A finer grind will yield a more robust cup of coffee. How much does a teaspoon of coffee weigh? We all know that coffee is a delicious morning beverage. But did you know that a teaspoon of coffee weighs quite a bit? In fact, a teaspoon of coffee weighs around 3 grams. So the next time you reach for your coffee mug, remember that you're picking up much more than just a cup. A teaspoon of coffee generally weighs between 2 and 3 grams. This can vary depending on the type of coffee and the grind size. A finer grind will generally weigh more than a coarse grind, and specialty coffees can weigh more than standard coffees. How to measure a teaspoon of coffee? A teaspoon of coffee weighs about 2.5 grams. Use a food scale or a measuring spoon to measure a teaspoon of coffee. How to convert grams to teaspoons? Converting grams to teaspoons is a simple process that only requires a little math. In general, 1 teaspoon of any substance weighs approximately 5 grams. So, to convert grams to teaspoons, you need to divide the number of grams by 5. For example, let's say you want to convert 10 grams of coffee to teaspoons. You would divide 10 by 5, which would give you 2 teaspoons. Easy peasy. Of course, this isn't an exact science, and the actual weight of a teaspoon of coffee will vary depending on the grind and density of the beans. But if you're looking for a quick and easy way to convert grams to teaspoons, this method should do the trick. How many cups of coffee in a pound? We all know a cup of coffee is around 8 ounces, give or take. But how many cups of coffee are in a pound? This is actually a challenging question to answer. The weight of coffee beans can vary widely, from very light to very dense. Thank you for watching, coffeeeternal.com.